Hello, my friend. I want to speak to you directly, without hosts, without sponsors, without the circus of Western media. Just you and me, looking calmly at the facts of power, war, and the choices that will decide the future of generations in Ukraine, in Russia, and far be. Right now, as we speak, American envoys are in Moscow, sitting across from Vladimir Putin and his senior team, presenting yet another plan to stop a war. Washington itself did everything to provoke and prolong. At the same time, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said something most Western commentators are too superficial to grasp. Russia is not looking for a short pause, not a ceasefire to reset the battlefield. Russia is talking about a settlement, FO. To understand what that means, you have to get past the slogans and look at the fundamentals. Territory, law, military. When Peskov says Russia wants a solution for generations, he's talking about something very precise, a legal, enforceable settlement that removes the threat to Russian security for decades, not a frozen conflict. Not another Minsk agreement the West can sign today and betray tomorrow. A final settlement in which Russia's gains and Russia's security needs are recognized as facts de jure, not just de facto. This is where historical precedent matters. Look at how the great wars of the last century ended. The so-called war to end all wars, World War I, didn't end anything because it combined humiliation with unfinished business. The Treaty of Versailles imposed punitive conditions on Germany, but the underlying resentments and ambitions were not contained. They were simply incubated until 1939. Contrast that with what happened after World War II, when Germany and Japan were not just defeated in practice. Their defeat was codified into law, borders, and military limitations. Territories were lost for good. Military capabilities were strictly capped. The message was simple. You can't rearm yourself and come back in 20 years for a rematch. Russia is thinking in exactly those terms today. If this war is going to end for generations, three pillars are non-negotiable from Moscow's point of view. First, territorial recognition. The regions Russia has incorporated, Novorossiya, Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and of course Crimea, must be recognized legally as Russian territory by the United States and NATO. Not just tolerated, not merely accepted as temporary facts on the ground, but recognized in law. Because anything less than that, any fudge like we'll leave it for later, or we won't talk about status, is simply an invitation for future revanchism. If Ukraine and its sponsors in Washington, London, Berlin, and Brussels can keep telling themselves these territories are merely occupied, then they are duty-bound in their own eyes to keep preparing to retake them. That guarantees another war. The lesson from Versailles is clear. When territories are lost as a result of total defeat and codified de jure, attempts to restore them by force become acts of aggression, not liberation. Germany tried in 1939, and we know how that ended. A settlement that will last has to resolve the status of these lands once and for all. They are Russian, and that is the end of the discussion. Second, demilitarization. Russia has said this from day one of its special military operation, and people in the West pretend not to hear it. Demilitarization is not a slogan. It is a concrete requirement. After World War I, Germany was limited to an army of 100,000. No submarines, no large capital ships above a certain tonnage. After 1945, the Japanese were limited to a self-defense force enshrined in their constitution. They were not supposed to operate as an expeditionary military power. Those limits existed for one reason: to prevent a defeated state from rearming and launching another war. Ukraine is going to have to be put into a similar box, and that's not a moral judgment, it's a strategic inevitability. A country that has been turned into a NATO forward operating base against Russia cannot be allowed to rebuild a force capable of repeating the same experiment. The Russian side has already worked through these parameters. Back in the Istanbul talks of 2022, there was an annex with very specific troop and equipment ceilings. Russia proposed force levels around 85,000. Ukraine wanted 250,000. Russia proposed strict limits on tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and especially missile ranges. No Ukrainian missiles beyond roughly 280 kilometers. That was before the West escalated by sending longer-range systems. Today, after everything that has happened, Russian demands will be harsher, not softer. Moscow has seen NATO pour in everything short of its own boots on the ground. It has watched Ukraine hit Russian cities, infrastructure, and even strategic early warning systems. There is zero chance Russia will accept a peace plan that leaves Ukraine with the ability to strike deep into Russian territory or to rebuild an army of several 100,000 troops backed by Western trainers and intelligence. For a settlement that lasts generations, Ukraine must not only be defeated, it must be structurally incapable of coming back for another round. Third, denazification. Western media loves to mock this word, but on the ground, it is very simple. Since 2014, Ukraine's state has codified anti-Russian hatred into law. Language discrimination, attacks on the Orthodox Church, glorification of Nazi collaborator figures, legal and social persecution of anyone who identifies as Russian or pro-Russian. That is not an accident. It is a deliberate ideological program. If that remains in place, you are simply training another generation to hate Russia and dream of a future war to liberate territory. In that case, it doesn't matter what any treaty says. The conflict goes underground and resurfaces in 10, 20, or 30 years with fresh blood. So yes, denazification is not a slogan, it is a non-negotiable requirement. A post-war Ukrainian authority, if one survives in any recognizable form, will have to dismantle the entire legal and cultural architecture of anti-Russian racism. Without that, any settlement is an illusion. On top of these three pillars, territorial recognition, demilitarization, denazification, there is another layer, money and looting. The so-called Miami Plan, the Geneva variants, the Abu Dhabi edits, all these American-designed documents have one thing in common. They are schemes to privatize Russian sovereign assets under the cover of reconstruction and peace. The proposal is as grotesque as it is revealing, seize roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank assets, then allocate $100 billion into some pseudo investment vehicle for Ukraine. Run, of course, by Western and especially American financial interests. The remaining $200 billion gets folded into a Russia-U.S. development fund, overseen by the same crowd, Kushner, Vekselberg-type figures, hedge fund sharks, connected families who view war as an entry ticket to asset stripping. Let's be blunt. This is an attempt to treat Russia like a defeated Axis power in 1945, but without defeating Russia. After World War II, the Allied control commissions in Germany and Italy did indeed manage and privatize those countries' economies under conditions of total military occupation and unconditional surrender. That is not the situation today. Russia is not defeated. Russia has not surrendered. Russia has not been occupied. Yet Washington still thinks it can design a plan in which Russian reserves are not only stolen, but transformed into profit streams for American and European elites. If they try to do this, the backlash will not be limited to Russia. Every non-Western state currently holding reserves in dollars and euros will receive the message. Your assets are not safe either. They can be seized and rerouted whenever Washington decides you are the bad guy. That accelerates the de-dollarization process and the fragmentation of the Western financial system. So when Peskov speaks about security for generations, he's also talking about the end of economic warfare as a default Western tool. Sanctions, asset seizures, arbitrary financial punishments, these are acts of war by other means. Russia will not accept a deal in which sanctions become a permanent blackmail mechanism, switched off or loosened case by case depending on who pays whom or who bribes which American official. And that brings us directly to the subject of corruption, not in Russia as Emmanuel Macron pretends, but in Ukraine, where the rot is structural. You cannot find a country without corruption. That is true. But the nature and function of corruption in Ukraine is what makes it central to this war. Ukraine has been used as a laundromat and a slush fund by Western elites since at least 2014, The flood of money poured into Kyiv from the US, EU, IMF, and various foundations hasn't just funded the Ukrainian military, it has enriched a narrowly connected network of oligarchs, politicians, security chiefs, and Western fixers. Hunter Biden's famous role with Burisma is not an isolated story, it is a visible thread of a much larger fabric. Western intelligence agencies, Western NGOs, and Western political families have all used Ukraine as a playground for money, for influence, for covert operations. The current anti-corruption campaigns and dramatic arrests in Kyiv are not serious efforts to clean up the system. They are factional purges, scapegoating exercises designed to replace one clique with another. Look at the names: Kolomoisky, Yermak, various deputy ministers, heads of agencies. When one of them is brought down, it is not because the system suddenly discovered its moral conscience. It is because he has become inconvenient to another faction or to Washington's current political needs. The scale of corruption, hundreds of billions channeled through the national bank, through private banks, through opaque schemes, dwarfs the individual scandals currently being fed into Western headlines. So when Western leaders lecture about Russian corruption while ignoring the systemic theft in Kiev, do not be fooled. This is about narrative manipulation, setting up fall guys to ease the passage toward a settlement, or preparing public opinion to blame internal corruption, not Western policy, for Ukraine's defeat. Meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron plays his role in this theater. Deeply unpopular at home, struggling to maintain authority, he needs the war as a tool to rule by decree, to rally some fragments of the French establishment around him, and to distract from domestic failures. He will talk about corruption in Russia today, in Ukraine tomorrow, in order to preserve his own skin. But what he will not do is expose large French units to a direct Russian counterattack and then explain coffins coming home. So his rhetoric is bravado without substance, a noisy facade over weak political ground. Behind all this, another core issue is emerging: legitimacy in Kyiv. From the Russian perspective, Zelensky is no longer a legitimate president. His mandate has expired. His rule is based on martial law and wartime emergency powers, not constitutional authority. Any document he signs, any peace agreement he puts his name on, can be dismissed by his successor as null and void. I do not recognize what the previous illegitimate authority signed, and he would have a case. That is why any serious settlement will require new elections in what remains of Ukraine, not a theatrical Western-sponsored circus, but a process in which at least some proportion of the population under a defeated, demilitarized, externally constrained regime expresses a new mandate. Of course, free and fair elections in a mutilated, war-torn state are more slogan than reality. Half the population is gone compared to 2014, dead, displaced, or immigrated. But structurally, Russia needs a counterpart that at least has formal constitutional legitimacy to sign and implement an agreement. Even then, one question remains: will any Ukrainian authority, however elected, have enough real power to enforce obligations on those who want to keep fighting for 100 years? That is why Russia insists not only on elections, but on enforcement mechanisms, demilitarization, external supervision, caps on weapon types, and the firm exclusion of foreign troops and nuclear weapons from Ukrainian territory. All the Western fantasies about security guarantees for Ukraine that include NATO membership, nuclear deployments, or permanent foreign troop contingents inside Ukraine are dead on arrival from Moscow's point of view. Russia is not going to accept the very scenario it went to war to prevent. There have been numerous Russian drafts and proposals, including early ones in Istanbul, which already made this clear. No foreign bases, no NATO infrastructure, no US or NATO troops, no joint crews operating long-range systems. Ukraine will not be a platform for a second round of NATO's proxy war. The West can rage about that, but strategically, it has no answer except escalation into a direct NATO-Russia conflict, which it is in no condition to fight. To see how we reach this point, we have to zoom out and look at the long war against Russia, a war that did not begin in 2014 or 2022, but a century ago. Since the Bolshevik Revolution, Western planning circles have repeatedly treated Russia, first Soviet, then post-Soviet, as the primary geopolitical enemy. Before Hitler, Western elites toyed with the idea of using Germany as a battering ram against the USSR. They signed non-aggression and security treaties only when forced or when it suited them, and several times they betrayed those agreements. After World War II, the Cold War was not a mere ideological struggle. It involved concrete war plans, including nuclear first strike scenarios, aimed at annihilating the Soviet Union before it could fully develop its deterrent. Those plans only died when mutually assured destruction became a reality, when any first strike on Moscow guaranteed an answer that would wipe out New York, Washington, London, and Paris. From then on, the West shifted towards proxy wars and peripheral operations. Afghanistan, in the 1,980 seconds, for instance, was deliberately turned into a quagmire for Soviet forces. Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter openly pursued that strategy. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the war moved into the economic sphere. Shock therapy, mass privatization, asset stripping. These were not accidents. They were deliberate policies pushed by Western advisors, applauded in Western media, and catastrophic for millions of Russians who died early from poverty, social collapse, and the destruction of healthcare and social support systems under Yeltsin. Vladimir Putin came to power in a Russia that had been gutted, humiliated, and carved up. He inherited two intertwined problems: internal fragmentation, including the Chechen wars and separatist projects in the Caucasus, and external encirclement through NATO expansion and color revolutions. He dealt first with internal security, cracking down on the Chechen insurgency, re-centralizing the state, and slowly rebuilding the economy. But as domestic coherence improved, the West shifted to external pressure on Russia's borders, Georgia in 2008, then the push to turn Ukraine into a hostile fortress facing east. Putin warned the West explicitly at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. Russia would not accept NATO's eastward march, turning former Soviet republics into launching pads for coercion and aggression. He was ignored. In 2014, while Putin was hosting the Sochi Olympics and projecting a peaceful, confident Russia to the world, Washington and its allies were bankrolling and orchestrating a coup in Kyiv. Western foreign ministers signed a deal with President Yanukovych and then watched, without protest, as radicals tore it up within hours and seized power by force. This was the opening shot of the current phase of the war against Russia. Ukraine as a full-spectrum NATO proxy, armed, trained, financed, and directed to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Could Russia have acted earlier, in 2014, to prevent this? Many in Russia think so. Many argue that Putin waited too long, issued red lines, and then allowed them to be crossed, hoping that the West would eventually recognize the danger. But by February 2022, the strategic calculus was clear. Either act or accept a NATO missile and force presence on Russia's doorstep, with Crimea and Donbass as the next targets. The special military operation launched in 2022 was meant initially to produce a rapid political collapse in Kyiv, a counter-coup, if you like. Russian special forces landing near Kyiv, operations like those at Hostomel, were designed to trigger a pivot in Ukraine's elite, a forced change of course, new leadership, and a negotiated neutral status. That attempt failed. Elite Russian units paid a heavy price. Western intelligence and special forces poured in support. The Ukrainian state did not crack the way some in Moscow expected. Russia did what serious powers do when their first plan fails. It adjusted. It shifted to a grinding attritional war, mobilized its defense industry, restructured its command, and let its advantages in manpower, artillery, and industrial capacity speak over time. It also continued to negotiate, as Istanbul showed. The problem was that the West, particularly London and Washington, would not accept a negotiated outcome that left Russia in a stronger position. So they sabotaged that track and pushed Ukraine to fight on until victory. That victory has not come. The Ukrainian army has been bled white. NATO equipment has been destroyed by the hundreds, then thousands. The supposed wonder weapons have made no strategic difference. The Russian army has absorbed its own mistakes, learned hard lessons, rotated through the front, and kept advancing. Inside Russia, this has changed public opinion. A growing majority now sees the United States, not Ukraine, as the primary enemy. Polls show that more Russians identify America as the real adversary than the Kyiv regime itself. They understand that Ukrainian troops are the tools, not the authors, of this war. Confidence in the army remains high. Support for the political leadership is closely correlated with battlefield performance. Whenever Russians suspect that their political elites might trade away hard-fought victories in a bad deal with Washington, skepticism spikes. There is deep concern inside Russia that any settlement dictated or shaped by Washington will not be worth the paper it's written on. The Russian people have watched 30 years of broken promises, NATO expansion, missile defense, Minsk agreements, never implemented in good faith. And they draw the obvious conclusion. The only guarantees that matter are those enforced by Russian power, not American signatures. That logic applies not only in Ukraine, but also in other theaters where Washington is trying to impose its will, for example, Venezuela. The same Trump administration that poses as anti-globalist, anti-Soros, anti-regime change, has in practice embraced the same toolkit. Threats, economic warfare, covert operations, and attempts to strangle sovereign states that refuse to obey Washington. Look at Trump's behavior toward Venezuela. Publicly, he has called for regime change, denounced the government in Caracas, and now escalated issuing warnings about airspace over and around Venezuela, urging airlines and pilots to treat it as effectively closed. Let's be clear, there is no legal basis for this. Trump's tweet declaring Venezuelan airspace closed is not a no-fly zone enforced by the U.S. Air Force. There is no UN mandate, no formal declaration of war, no authorization to shoot down civilian aircraft. It is pure psychological warfare, an attempt to isolate Venezuela economically and diplomatically by spooking airlines and businesses into self-sanctioning. Some large carriers have already buckled. Emirates, Lufthansa, and others have suspended direct flights to Caracas, hiding their compliance with American pressure behind vague language about conditions or operational reasons. They then route traffic through code share arrangements with regional carriers most people have barely heard of. The intent is obvious. Starve Venezuela of connectivity, make travel and commerce more difficult, and blame the resulting hardship on Caracas, not Washington. President Maduro's response has been straightforward and logical. He has warned airlines that those who obey Trump's illegal warning and abandon the Venezuelan market will lose their licenses and routes permanently. Those routes will be given to other carriers who are willing to operate under international law rather than Washington's intimidation. In other words, if you want the profits, you accept the risks of defying an illegal U.S. dictate. If you side with Trump's tweet, don't expect to walk back in when the dust settles. Washington's plan is not a serious military effort. It is an extortion racket. Trump, his family, and his backers understand the politics of threat and bluff, not symmetrical warfare. He escalates his rhetoric constantly, talks about closed airspace, about criminal migrants, about drug gangs, but the moment he faces real deterrent capability, he backs down or blurs his own words. When asked directly whether his warning implied an imminent airstrike on Venezuela, he tells reporters, "Don't read anything into it." That's not the language of a leader preparing a serious military campaign. It is the language of a casino operator applying pressure without wanting to pick a real fight. Yes, the U.S. has built up forces in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, in nearby waters. Yes, there are planners who would love to stage another Bay of Pigs, this time with modern air and naval power. But they know, just as we do, that Venezuela is not defenseless. An attempted invasion or serious air campaign would trigger resistance, casualties, and a blowback the U.S. political system is not prepared to absorb. So we see the same pattern again. Trump threatens more than he can deliver, then looks for ways to camouflage his retreat. He may convene high-profile meetings in the White House with hardline advisors like Stephen Miller. He may posture with generals and cabinet secretaries, but at the end of the day, he is trying to find a way to continue pressure without paying the price of open war. The whole thing becomes a theater of menace, enough to scare corporations, banks, and risk-averse executives, but not enough to trigger open confrontation. The problem for Washington is that this model is losing credibility.